Our first speaker will be Lucky Garcia. She's a veteran who served in Iraq, was a sergeant in the Army and served for 8 years and was in Iraq from 2004 to 2006. She's an active member of Veterans for Peace. She's originally from Vail, Colorado, and has been in Kansas City for the past 6 years. So I'll turn it over to Lucky Garcia.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. First, I'd like to thank the UMKC Economics Club, Ira Harriet, and the American Friends Services Committee, and the KC Greens for having me here tonight. I'd also like to thank the veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars who I see in the audience today. And I'd especially like to thank veterans of previous wars who are in the audience today. Today we'll be discussing the impacts of the Iraq War, but I assure you that those men and women had it a lot worse than I did. So thank you for your service. This is the first time that I've publicly discussed any of my experiences in Iraq. It's still very sensitive to me, as it is to many veterans. So please bear with me as I kind of stumble through this speech, I'm sure. I served in the United States Army, like Ira said, and the United States Army Reserve for 8 years. My last deployment took me to Iraq for about 1.5 years. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be an expert in the impacts of the war, or in politics, or in the economics of the war. But I am here today to discuss some of my experiences and a little about the human consequences of this war. There are many of these consequences, and they're often ignored, or some are not even discussed, even in progressive and anti-war circles. I hope that today I can bring some of this to the forefront with this group, and I hope that later down the road you'll have more discussions about these issues. Well, we can't ignore this headline. U.S. soldier kills up to 16 Afghan civilians in shooting spree. 9 children and 3 women dead. This is a very real and very recent human impact of the war. The servicemen had multiple previous tours, including service in Iraq. When we send troops on deployment after deployment, when we ignore the truth, when we ignore the damage that's been done to these people, to the veterans, and when our leaders promote a racist justification for murder, this kind of thing happens. These crimes are what I think inspired a young boy to get his hands on an AK-47 and say, "Sign me up, Al-Qaeda." What would you do? What would you do if your family was murdered like this? Who the heck do we think we are to do this to our own people, much less anybody else? Those victims had families, and that soldier has family too. There's a giant ripple effect of these kinds of things. I have a friend who has a dear friend who has served, I think, 8 or 9 tours of duty, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he still wants to go back. First off, this is very interesting to me. It's very interesting to me how the Army can deem a person mentally and physically fit for duty after spending 9 years in a war zone. How is someone who wants to go back to combat fit for combat? Those are some of the questions I have. My friend thinks that his friend is addicted to murder. He could be. I don't know. What I do know is that when you return from Iraq, you leave a big part of yourself back in the desert. And it takes a long time to realize that you'll never get that back. Some people, when they return, they feel very exploited and even alienated from people here. They just can't seem to fit back into their old life. That person doesn't exist anymore. And unfortunately, the only thing that makes us feel normal, the only thing that makes us feel like we're not monsters, is to go back. Is to go back there. And that is another thing that seems very, very weird to me. And it's weird with myself. Why? That's, that place is the root of our nightmares. Why would anybody want to go back there? Why is it that when I think of it, I feel some sort of peace? It's very, maybe we need a psychology person. But that's very odd to me. And then, of course, when we're in Iraq, we don't have to discuss or talk about our issues. In fact, we're highly encouraged to not acknowledge our trauma at all. This is the human impact of the Iraq War. Now, I'm about to review a bunch of statistics on some of the effects of the war that the war has had on people. And I typically don't like to discuss numbers because it's usually a sure way to get eyeballs to gloss over. The economists here are like... But I've selected this approach because these numbers mean a lot to me and they provide perspective for me. When I was in Iraq, we rarely knew what was going on in the rest of the country or with the rest of the war, let alone the politics behind it all. I may have seen some schools or hospitals or homes destroyed, maybe a panhandler there, or excuse me, maybe a weeping mother over a body over there. And of course there were the losses of our own. But I had no idea to what degree, and what frequency this was all happening in the country. And to be honest, I was just trying to stay alive. I had a 20-minute phone call home once every couple of weeks. No internet, no television, no media, just orders. Ironically, it wasn't until I returned home from the war that I gained awareness of the horrific politics and the devastating realities of the war. So these numbers have allowed me to see the war for what it really is, and at a much higher level. 4,804 U.S. and coalition military fatalities. 140 here in Kansas, Missouri, from here in Kansas, Missouri. I know that number doesn't come close to the number of casualties of previous wars, but let me remind you of how many weapons of mass destruction we actually found. 0. It's not like those people died trying to protect millions of people from being forced into concentration camps or from being slaughtered. 32,223 U.S. troops wounded. 150,000 to 400,000 civilians killed. Thousands of suicides and suicide attempts every year. Over 1,000 homeless veterans of this war between the ages of 18 and 30 just were added to the already existing 145,000 veterans, homeless veterans we have. And the countless others who have fallen to drug and alcohol abuse, depression, PTSD, and have generally disconnected from their families, friends, and society. And I won't leave here today without calling out the violence and abuse that we've brought home to our husbands, wives, girlfriends, boyfriends, the violence that we've brought to our children. This is the human impact of the Iraq War. And then there are the Iraqi people. 4.5 million orphans now. 2 million widows. 1.3 million people displaced internally in Iraq. Millions without clean water, electricity, education, and without opportunity.